Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, you've seen the best TEDx speakers go and stand on that red spot. I'm going to hide behind this thing and pretend to be a clever lawyer, and that makes you lot Judge Judy, so how's that? I want to start, if I can make this work, with, I know this will do it, with that image. It's a photo I took last year. It may look like something like an abandoned bus shelter in Doncaster or a storeroom that's fallen into neglect, but it's actually something much more interesting than that. We're in the Belize Central Prison there, and it's an image that, for me, combines feelings of horror with sort of satisfaction, is the best way I can put it. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But I want to talk to you tonight about the death penalty, and in particular, the use of the mandatory death penalty as a form of punishment at the end of a criminal trial. Now, the mandatory death penalty means that everybody who's convicted of a particular offence, and normally it's going to be murder, is given the same sentence of death. So the sentence is automatic. It doesn't matter what the circumstances of the offence were, and it doesn't matter what the circumstances of the offender are. The only sentence is death. Now, I'm not going to talk about the merits or the demerits of the death penalty itself. That's a whole other topic, and I'd happily come back another day and talk to you about that. But by the end of my talk, in fact, a long time before then, you'll have worked out, I think, where I stand on that. The death penalty itself is alive not particularly well. And in some parts of the world, as you just heard, it's still used a great deal. The number of countries that still use a death penalty has, in fact, fallen quite significantly in the last few decades. And in many of the countries that still execute people, like America and China, by the way, accounts for more than all the other countries in the world put together, probably by several times of people executed. But in all those countries that are still executing people, in many of them, the number of people being executed has in fact fallen quite significantly in recent years too. And then an extra element of the picture is that in many countries that still have the death penalty in their laws, they're not actually carrying out executions. And there haven't been any executions in Belize, for instance, and the countries I work in Africa for decades. So the position is changing, but we still have the death penalty existing in many different parts of the world. And this is a map produced by Amnesty International. I'm sure you know that Amnesty International is one of the leading human rights organizations in the world. I've done work with them in the Soviet Union when it still existed, and other parts of that part of the world. And their map shows various things that have been happening. So the countries in blue and in that sort of yellowy, dirty yellow color, those countries have abolished the death penalty completely in their laws, or almost completely, to all effects. For all purposes, it's been abolished. The countries in orange are countries that have the death penalty on their books and their laws, but are not actually carrying out constitutions, so they're called de facto abolitionist countries. And it's the dirty brown, or whatever you want to call that, other color, that's where people are still being executed. So that's the overview of the position at the moment. But the next thing that I wanted to look at is really a bit of a history story, and that's about the mandatory death penalty itself. And the story of the mandatory death penalty begins right here in England. So you heard just now that we abolished the death penalty in 1965, 50 odd years ago. But until then, the death penalty had been the only punishment for murder for hundreds of years. This map here, as you may have guessed, is a map of our great British Empire at its maximum extent. And as the empire extended, the countries that we colonized acquired legal systems that were based on the legal system of England. And as part of that process, we exported the mandatory death penalty from England for murder and for certain other offences right across the empire. The mandatory death penalty was also a feature in the United States, although the situation wasn't the same in all the different states of the United States, and it still isn't the same. There's some very significant differences. So, for instance, when you looked at the map before, you saw a big blob of Alaska as having the death penalty. The state of Alaska hasn't executed anyone for a very long time, but because it's all part of the United States, it gets coloured in that colour. Anyway, so when the British colonies became independent in the 20th century, the countries of the British Empire became independent in the 20th century, they kept their colonial criminal laws. And even today, most countries that inherited the mandatory death penalty still have it in their laws, although, again, many of them don't carry it out in practice. And one of those countries was Belize. The story in Belize that I've been involved in and connected with began almost exactly 20 years ago. There was a man in Belize called Patrick Reyes. He had an argument with his neighbors, and like many neighbor arguments, it was about a fence between their properties. Mr. Reyes came back from home one day, and his neighbor was building a fence he didn't think he ought to be building. And so Mr. Reyes, unfortunately, had a gun, and he took it out. He lost his temper. He shot the neighbor and killed him, and he also shot the neighbor's wife and killed her. And then when he realized what he'd done, he turned the gun on himself and shot himself and didn't kill himself. So eventually he more or less recovered. He was tried for murder, and he was given the only sentence that could be given for murder in Belize, to be taken to a place of execution and hanged by the neck until he was dead. Now, Mr. Reyes' lawyer was aware that there had been challenges, legal challenges in court to the mandatory death penalty in America and in India, and he thought it would be a good idea to bring another legal challenge, but this time in Belize. And he knew that there was an organization in London called the Death Penalty Project that I do all my pro bono work with, that had been interested in representing people who were facing sentences of death. So he said to the Death Penalty Project, let's bring a case in Belize, and on your topic of development and innovation, let's try and innovate here, develop, extend the legal principles and bring it to a different jurisdiction with a different set of laws, but try and get rid of the mandatory death penalty and use this case as a vehicle for achieving that. So that's what happened. The Belize lawyer worked with two of my colleagues in my chambers and the Death Penalty Project, and they brought a case up to the highest court of Belize, which is in fact the Privy Council, which is a court of judges who sit in London, but it's the highest court of Belize. And they argued their case. And the fact that lawyers in England, we share a common legal heritage with lawyers in Belize and other countries that used to be part of the British Empire, means that we are able to work together on cases like this and share our experience and our expertise and work together on the arguments in cases like this. So what they argued in this case was that the death penalty, if it was going to be used at all, had to be used in strict accordance with the law. And that includes the written constitution of Belize, which says that nobody should be given a punishment which is inhuman. And that same legal principle can be found in almost all the constitutions of the former British colonies. These constitutions are the supreme law, which means that if a court decides that a particular criminal law is inconsistent with the Constitution, the relevant part of the law is treated as invalid. So to that extent, the courts can strike down that part of the legislation because it's unconstitutional. And the standard they're applying in that process is not English law, it's a standard of the Belize Constitution or the Constitution of Kenya if it's a case in Kenya, or the Constitution of Singapore if it's a case in Singapore, whatever it may be. What they argued was that imposing the death penalty for murder on a mandatory basis automatically was inhuman. So the first argument that they said applied in this case was that essentially the penalty has to fit the crime. People were being sentenced to death with no consideration of the circumstances of the offence that they had committed. Now, you might not have given much thought to this, but the fact is that murders cover a huge variety of factual situations. If I am married to my wife, I've been married for 50 years, she's suffering from a terrible illness, she's in pain every day, she's begging for me to help her end her life. And I, out of my love and my mercy and my compassion, I kill my wife to save her from pain. That is murder. And if I go out and find lots of little children and torture and kill them, that is murder. And when the sentence is mandatory, the law doesn't make any distinction according to the facts of the offence. It simply says, kill, 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 kill. And that, the lawyers argued, has to be inhuman. The second thing they argued is that it's wrong not to take account of the personal circumstances of the offender, to at least ask the question, well, how did this person get to the place they're in? How did they come to commit that particular offence? And if you don't look at those things, you don't consider those questions, that too is inhuman. So those arguments were argued, and they were successful. The court decided that the mandatory death penalty was legally invalid because it violated the constitution of Belize. And that meant that in future, the death penalty could only be used in really exceptionally serious cases. That was a legal principle that came out of that case. And in Mr. Reyes' case, it meant that he was taken off death row, he was given a life imprisonment sentence, and that's what he's serving now. He's serving a life imprisonment. But beyond his own case, this case had very far-reaching consequences, because since that decision, not a single person in Belize has been sentenced to death. So although, unfortunately, there are murders in Belize, as in any other country, the courts have never said, well, this particular case is so exceptionally serious that it deserves to have the death penalty. So that means that it's good news in terms of sentencing that's taking place in Belize. But the other thing to be aware of is that in Belize, nobody has in fact been executed since 1985, since long before the Reyes case happened. But the problem of giving people death sentences at all, even if they aren't for the time being executed, is that all it takes is for a government minister to say, okay, I think we need to send a message out that we're going to be tough on crime and tough on criminals. And the minister just has to sign a piece of paper, and that person could then be executed. So it really matters that people aren't being sentenced to death, even if they aren't in fact being executed. Which brings me back to where we started. You've probably worked out for yourselves by now what that is. That is the execution chamber in Belize Central Prison. The picture's not terribly clear, but you can probably see there's a chain hanging from the ceiling, and that's where the noose would hang. And there's a trap door which has been left open, and just behind it, as you can see, there's a big metal lever. You pull the lever, the trap door opens with a very loud bang, and the prisoner falls through the hole and hopefully is killed very quickly. But sometimes it goes wrong and gets very messy indeed. So I hope you can see now why I said it's an image that fills me with horror, but also a certain sense of satisfaction, because the execution chamber, as you can see, is in a happy state of neglect and disrepair. The death penalty in Belize isn't mandatory anymore. It's not being imposed as a sentence by the courts, and nobody is in fact being executed, and that, to my mind, is progress. Now, the case of Reyes became famous as a precedent for cases in other countries that had inherited the mandatory death penalty. First of all, it spread through the Caribbean, and the death penalty was used quite frequently in the former British colonies in the Caribbean. Today, the mandatory death penalty has almost completely been removed from the Caribbean countries, and there hasn't been an execution in the Caribbean for many years. And from the Caribbean, the legal arguments then spread to Africa, which is where I got involved. So the first thing that happened was that there were some lawyers in Uganda who had heard about the Reyes case, and they contacted the Death Penalty Project and said, look, we know we've got a different jurisdiction, our laws are somewhat different, but the principles are very similar because we've all inherited that same colonial system of laws. So why don't we have a go at challenging the mandatory death penalty in Uganda? And let's do the job properly. Let's do it for everybody on death row. That's over 400 prisoners, because they'd all been given mandatory sentences of death. So my colleagues in Chambers and the Death Penalty Project and the Ugandan lawyers all worked together. They brought a case on the mandatory death penalty in Uganda. They won the case, and that meant that all those prisoners had their sentences commuted. What then happened was that I was asked by my colleagues in London and my colleagues in Malawi to help to bring a similar case in Malawi. We brought the case in the Constitutional Court, we won the case in Malawi, and the mandatory death penalty in Malawi was abolished. We then brought a case in Kenya with our Kenyan colleagues. We won that case. While we were arguing the case, the president of Kenya, perhaps sensing which way the court was going to go, ordered that everybody who'd been sentenced to death in Kenya would have their sentences commuted. Over 4,000 people on death row had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment in that one decision. Then things started getting a bit tricky in Kenya, because there was another case in which the court said that our case was wrongly decided, and so we
helped our lawyers, our colleagues in Kenya, to bring another case in the new Supreme Court of Kenya. And right now, today, we're waiting for the Supreme Court of Kenya to give its decision on that case. And we're pretty optimistic we're going to win, not least because the government of Kenya agrees that the mandatory death penalty is unconstitutional under the laws of Kenya. And that too, if that decision is successful, will affect thousands of people in Kenya who are on death row. Then we brought a case in Ghana. And this is one of the cases you heard about where I was helping to advise and represent a British citizen called Dexter Johnson, who'd been sentenced to death for murder. And he was given, again, a mandatory sentence of death. Unfortunately, we lost that case in Ghana, in the Supreme Court of Ghana. That was the highest court. We couldn't go any higher in the Ghana court. So we made an application to something called the Human Rights Committee, which is a body, broadly speaking, of the United Nations. And we won that case. We argued that this mandatory taking away of life for all offences of murder was a breach of Ghana's international legal obligations. And that argument had already been made in respect of other countries, and unsurprisingly, we won the argument. But unfortunately, the Human Rights Committee's decisions are not binding on the government of Ghana, and they ignored it. So Mr. Johnson is still on death row in Ghana. So we don't give up. And right now, in fact, just before I came here today, I've been talking with my colleagues at the Death Penalty Project, and we're planning to bring a case in the African Court of Human Rights, whose decisions are binding if we win the case. So that's, I'll come back next year and tell you what happened in that. So apart from that, we have other cases coming up in Tanzania. We've had some litigation in Nigeria and various other places, and the work, as I say, goes on. So just wrapping up, these cases, I think, show how really important ideas can flow backwards and forwards across the world in quite different ways. And the idea of executing everybody who's committed a particular kind of offence travelled around the world by force of colonial conquest. That's how the idea was planted in the first place. But the reverse idea, the ideas that have pushed back the death penalty generally, and the mandatory death penalty in particular. They have travelled by a process of litigation, of persuasion, of perseverance, because not everything has gone our way, and we keep on fighting, and, as I hope I've made clear, by a great deal of teamwork, working always with our colleagues in Kenya, Malawi, and Belize, or wherever it may be. So that's how I spend my time when I'm not actually making a living with my clients in London. Reading and writing and rewriting legal arguments, working out how to represent the arguments that we need to make in various different countries under their laws and their constitutions. Earning a few air miles on the side, which is always useful. Looking forward to another trip to Kenya or another trip to Belize. In the meantime, it's been a pleasure making this trip to Sevenoaks School. Thank you very much.